Right, let's just jump straight into this explainer and crack open what has to be one of the absolute most gripping historical mysteries around the origins of modern religion. We're going to look at what history handed down to us, but more importantly, and honestly way more fascinatingly, what history intentionally left behind. Look, as a student of history, you already know the old saying, the victor writes the story. But what happens when the suppressed evidence actually survives? We're not talking about some fringe conspiracy theories or theoretical cover-ups here. We're talking about actual physical manuscripts, real documents dug out of the desert sand after being buried for centuries. It's the kind of tangible evidence that literally shifts the ground beneath our understanding of the past. So today we're putting on our objective scholar hats. We're going to examine early religious power structures, how institutional control was consolidated, and the incredible texts that got deliberately swept into the shadows.
Now, to really grasp the magnitude of this historical anomaly, we kind of need to set the scene. We have to look at the massive, unquestioned scale of the accepted narrative. For nearly 2,000 years, a highly specific, carefully curated timeline of events has been taught and accepted across the globe. We're talking about billions of people across millennia fundamentally believing the Bible contains the absolute, complete story of early Christianity. Think about the strategic impact of that for a second. Just from a purely organizational, professional standpoint, establishing a singular narrative is literally the ultimate exercise in narrative control. It's all about standardization. By monopolizing divine truth, early institutional leaders could consolidate power, unify totally disparate groups, and create a centralized, easily manageable hierarchy. Honestly, it's a level of historical consensus that's almost impossible for our modern minds to fully wrap around.
For millennia, the foundation of this status quo rested on three unshakable pillars. 1. The complete story of Christianity. 2. The final truth. And 3. The preserved Word of God. And hey, those aren't just labels, right? They are declarations of absolute authority. When you compare the texts that ultimately made it into the established biblical canon against the huge pool of writings that were actually floating around back then, a super clear pattern emerges. The canonical texts were favored and eventually chosen specifically because they backed up a hierarchical, centralized church structure. They drew very clear, neat lines of authority, from God to Jesus to the apostles and straight down to the bishops. The established canon left zero room for debate, zero room for addition, and absolutely no room for anything that might challenge the growing political power of Orthodox church leadership. It was boxed up and presented to the masses as a totally closed loop of divine history.
But what if that just wasn't the whole story? I really want you to pause and think about the implications of that question, because it challenges the very core of a globally accepted narrative. As inquisitive modern learners, we always have to look for the gaps, right? The silences in the historical record. For literally centuries, scholars only even knew these alternative texts existed because the established church fathers wrote these long, angry letters condemning them. We essentially only had the critics' side of the story. Well, actually scratch that. We only had their side until the mid-20th century when the Egyptian desert sands suddenly gave up their secrets. This incredible discovery provided actual physical evidence of the other side, proving that the neatly packaged history we've all been handed was actually the result of massive systematic curation.
Just imagine the atmosphere for a second. Picture flickering candlelight in early Christian communities across ancient Egypt or Syria. What if those ancient churches, the literal bedrock of early religious gatherings, possessed entirely different sacred writings? And to be clear, we are not talking about outsider documents or random secular histories here. We're talking about texts that were considered just as sacred and just as vital by the people reading them within those ancient walls. Because the wild thing is, these writings weren't initially forbidden. In the first few centuries after Jesus, early Christianity was incredibly diverse. The idea spread like wildfire, and these alternative texts were actively circulated, heavily debated, and cherished right alongside the writings that would eventually become the New Testament. The spiritual landscape back then was just vastly different from the massive, monolithic institution that eventually took hold.
Our sources point to books filled with absolutely astonishing contents. And looking at a few specific case studies really brings this to life. Take the Gospel of Thomas, for instance. Unlike the canonical Gospels we know, it doesn't focus on the death and resurrection of Jesus at all. No, instead it's this fascinating collection of secret wisdom sayings. Then you have the Gospel of Mary, which completely elevates Mary Magdalene. It portrays her as a top-tier disciple who possessed unique visionary authority, with teachings that the male disciples didn't even receive. And maybe most mind-blowing of all, the Gospel of Judas. This text flips the ultimate betrayal narrative entirely on its head, painting Judas not as a traitor, but actually as the one single disciple who truly understood Jesus' mission. The recurring theme across these and lots of other so-called Gnostic texts is pretty profound. It's the idea that the divine is found through internal enlightenment and secret personal knowledge, rather than through some external hierarchy. So you can probably guess that the disappearance of these texts was absolutely no historical accident. As our source material reveals, these stories were so controversial that emerging Orthodox church leaders basically decided the world should never, ever read them. But why? Well, let's think about the implications of that recurring theme we just talked about, internal enlightenment. If salvation and divine connection come entirely from within yourself through your own secret personal knowledge, will you fundamentally bypass the need for church authority? You don't need a bishop, you don't need a priest, and you for sure don't need a centralized church mediating your relationship with God. This was not just some polite theological disagreement. It was a direct existential threat to the church's entire institutional model and their political power structure. To establish a unified authority, competing ideas couldn't just be debated, they literally had to be eradicated.
And this brilliantly frames the dual historical outcomes we're looking at today. Over on side A, we have the preserved word, the texts that were championed, carefully protected, copied over and distributed to billions as the one final truth. But right alongside it, on side B, we have the forbidden chronicles. Unearthing these vanished, rejected texts entirely changes how we view modern religious authority. It forces both historians and modern believers to realize that early Christianity was absolutely not a monolithic, unified movement right out of the gate. It was a vibrant, messy, highly diverse marketplace of competing ideas. The stark contrast between what was elevated and what was erased is a huge reminder. It reminds us that religious authority isn't necessarily just a divine absolute. It's also the result of a very human, very political victory of one specific faction over everybody else.
But it wasn't enough to just ignore these alternative teachings. Some were explicitly declared dangerous. I mean, really think about the gravity of that word. A collection of words on paper was viewed by massive religious authorities as a literal threat to their entire institution. To save these vital spiritual documents from being burned and permanently destroyed by Orthodox authorities, local monks actually had to hide them. And that gives us the profound physical reality of these manuscripts today. They weren't preserved in grand, beautiful cathedrals. They survived as fragile, deteriorating papyrus codices, bound up in scrap leather, carefully sealed inside heavy clay jars, and hidden deep in the Egyptian desert caves of Nag Hammadi. These incredibly fragile remnants were shoved into the dark simply because the ideas written on them were just too powerful for the established order to tolerate.
Which brings us right back to a profound mystery that history itself tried to bury. We now know what many of these forbidden books contained, and we know exactly why ancient churches worked so incredibly hard to keep them hidden. The secret teachings were so potent and so institutionally disruptive that they literally had to be silenced for millennia. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want you to carry this forward-looking thought with you. If the very foundation of this globally established narrative was built, at least in part, on burying competing voices, how many other absolute truths in our human history are simply just the stories of the victors? And honestly, even more intriguingly, what other forgotten chronicles might still be waiting out there, buried deep in the desert sands, just ready to rewrite the history we thought we knew?